10 helicopters rose into the night sky over southern Lebanon without a single light on. No formation signals. No radio chatter that anyone outside the operation would hear. They moved fast and low, and they were not carrying ammunition or reinforcements. They were carrying the dead and the wounded from what Israeli media would quietly describe before the censorship order came down as the single deadliest strike on Israeli forces in the entire Lebanon campaign. Within hours, the Israeli military shut everything down. No casualty numbers, no names, no footage, no explanation, just silence dropping over the story like a blackout curtain. And on the other side of the Atlantic, in the country whose taxpayers are funding this war and whose soldiers are now being moved into position for its most dangerous phase yet, the story barely registered. That silence is not negligence. It is a policy. And right now, that policy is concealing something that cuts to the heart of why American soldiers might soon be ordered into the most operationally complex and strategically treacherous military environment on Earth, and why the partner that stood next to Washington when this war began has now quietly signaled to its own domestic media that when that moment arrives, it will not be standing there anymore. Let that settle for a moment. Israel's Channel 12, one of the country's most widely watched broadcast networks, has reported that if the United States launches a ground operation against Iran, Israeli soldiers will not be participating, not in a limited role, not in a supporting capacity, not at all. The United States entered this conflict on February 28, 2026, shoulder to shoulder with Israel in a coordinated surprise strike framed as a shared mission toward a shared objective. Since that night, 13 American service members have been confirmed killed. More than 300 have been wounded. Gas prices across the United States have climbed by more than $1 per gallon. The Strait of Hormuz remains under sustained pressure. Over 3,000 people have been killed across the conflict zone. And now, 5 weeks into a war that was presented to the American public as a partnership, that partner has told its own press corps it plans to sit out the next phase entirely. This is not a minor diplomatic disagreement. This is not a scheduling conflict. This is the country whose security concerns were used as the primary justification for American involvement, walking away from the shared burden at the exact moment that burden is about to become most severe. And the mechanism being used to keep this from becoming a national conversation in America is the same one that swallowed the story of 10 helicopters flying in the dark. Controlled silence applied selectively at scale. To understand how this situation developed, you have to start with what is actually happening on the ground in Lebanon, because the battlefield reality there and the coming decision point on Iran are not separate stories. They are the same story told from two different directions. Israel launched its ground campaign in southern Lebanon on March 16, 2026. The stated objective was defined and limited. Push Hezbollah north of the Litani River, establish a security buffer, end the rocket fire that has been hitting northern Israeli communities. Israeli officials had spent months describing Hezbollah as a degraded force, its command and control disrupted, its senior leadership eliminated, its operational capacity reduced to a fraction of what it once was. That was the official version going into the campaign. Here is what the operational version looks like 5 weeks later. Approximately 400,000 Israeli troops have been mobilized for this campaign. As of this week, Israeli forces have not established control over a single frontline town in southern Lebanon. Ground advance routes have been described by observers with direct access to the front using a phrase that does not require much interpretation, a graveyard for tanks. A senior Israeli security official cited by Channel 12 expressed deep pessimism specifically about the scale and coordination of simultaneous attacks coming from Lebanon and Iran at the same time. Because the Hezbollah, that was supposed to be a weakened, scattered organization, coordinated its strikes from Lebanon to arrive at the exact moment that Iranian missile salvos were already saturating Israeli air defense systems. That is not the behavior of a militia scraping together its remaining resources. That is an organization that preserved its most capable units, held them in reserve, and waited for the moment when deploying them would do maximum damage to an opponent already stretched across multiple fronts. Then came the night of the helicopters. More than 10 aircraft evacuating the dead and wounded from the worst single strike of the campaign. And within hours, total military censorship. For Israeli audiences, fragments of the story escaped before the order came down. For Americans funding the war, it was as if the night never happened. While that story was being buried, something else was being built in plain sight, though without the framing that would allow most people to understand what they were looking at. 2,500 United States Marines trained specifically for amphibious landing operations have arrived in the Middle East. President Trump told the Financial Times he was considering seizing Karg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal in the Persian Gulf. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said publicly that the United States military could achieve its objectives without putting ground troops inside Iran. The president, in the same week, did not rule ground troops out. A former Marine Corps officer currently serving in Congress laid out what happens if those Marines receive the order to move. They will execute the mission. These are disciplined professionals, and they do not leave assignments unfinished. But within 15 to 30 days, they will require reinforcements and resupply at a scale that transforms a pressure operation into a sustained military commitment. What gets announced as a limited strike becomes, through the simple operational logic of holding contested territory against a motivated enemy on its own coastline, something far longer and far larger than any press conference will acknowledge. Independent analysts and published Pentagon wargaming have looked at a ground operation in Iran and arrived at the same conclusions repeatedly. Iran has a population of 90 million people. Its territory is 4 times the geographic size of Iraq. Its terrain, the Zagros Mountains, the vast interior deserts, has historically consumed invading forces across centuries. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent 40 years constructing a military doctrine built specifically for this scenario. The analytical consensus points to hundreds of thousands of troops, years of occupation, and casualties that would exceed the combined losses of every American military engagement since September 2001. And the country that was supposed to share that burden has announced it is not coming. Israeli security expert Dr. Simon Sapis was explicit about why. Israel, he said, lacks both the troops and the equipment for a ground operation in Iran. This is not reluctance born from political calculation. This is the operational reality of a military fighting simultaneously on 3 ground fronts, Gaza, Lebanon, and the West Bank, and 2 aerial fronts against Iran and Yemen. The IDF is not a force sitting in reserve waiting to be committed. It is a force in active contact across 5 theaters, absorbing casualties in each one, including casualties in Lebanon serious enough that the military imposed total information suppression within hours of the first reports. Retired Brigadier General Israel Shafi said plainly that the Israeli public is exhausted, that a joint ground operation in Iran is not in Israel's interest, and that the support simply does not exist. The American public is not far behind on that exhaustion. A Reuters and Ipsos survey released last week found that 7% of Americans support a ground invasion of Iran. Not a slim majority opposed, not a divided public. 7% in favor. And this opposition is not coming only from one direction politically. Republican Congressman Tim Burchett stated plainly that there is no appetite for a ground conflict in Iran among lawmakers. At CPAC in Texas, former Representative Matt Gaetz told the crowd that a ground invasion would make America poorer and less safe, citing higher gas prices, higher food costs, and no reliable guarantee that the operation would eliminate more threats than it would generate. A visible fracture opened at that event, not at the margins of the political conversation, but at its center, a direct challenge to the operational logic currently being pursued. Democrats on the House Armed Services Committee sent a formal request to Pentagon officials this week for a public hearing stating that classified briefings had not provided the oversight they were constitutionally entitled to. The people whose institutional responsibility is to know what is being planned are on record saying they do not have a complete picture at the exact moment when the most consequential decisions of this conflict are being made. Meanwhile, a separate track is running in parallel. On March 29th, the foreign ministers of Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt met in Islamabad without American or Israeli participation. Pakistan has emerged as the primary diplomatic intermediary in this conflict. Egypt's foreign minister described the purpose as opening a channel for dialogue that does not require either side to publicly acknowledge direct contact because both are currently denying it. Iran's position on any ceasefire arrangement is clear and deliberately constructed. Lebanon must be included. Any agreement that ends military pressure on Iran while Israeli operations in Lebanon continue is unacceptable. This is not a miscalculation on Iran's part. It is a structural trap designed to expose the gap between what Washington needs and what Israel needs by making any resolution contingent on resolving both simultaneously. Washington needs a framework on Iran's nuclear program and on the Strait of Hormuz badly enough to stabilize energy markets and claim a credible win domestically. Israel needs to complete its objectives in Lebanon before it can accept any ceasefire linked to that front. These goals can coexist in theory. Iran has engineered the terms so that in practice they pull in opposite directions. On March 28th, Houthi forces in Yemen entered the conflict, adding a fifth operational front to the pressure map. This is not a geographic expansion in isolation. This is the Iranian strategic model activating precisely as designed. Not a single military force holding a single front, but a distributed network of actors, each with independent strategic depth, each adding cost at a different point. Hezbollah synchronizing with Iranian missile salvos. Iraqi militia groups striking American positions in Iraq and Syria. Now the Houthis increasing pressure on Red Sea shipping and maritime routes. Iran does not need to win in any conventional sense. Iran needs the cost of continuing this conflict to exceed the political capacity of Washington to keep absorbing it. Every new front is another variable in that calculation. The costs being absorbed are not theoretical. Gas prices are up more than $1 per gallon since the conflict began. Roughly 30% of global ammonia production, the fertilizer that underlies corn, wheat, rice, and soybean cultivation worldwide, is exposed to continued strikes on Gulf energy infrastructure. American farmers making spring planting decisions right now are doing so against a supply disruption that will not resolve quickly. Supertanker daily rates have reached historic highs. Multiple major shipping companies have rerouted vessels out of the Gulf entirely. These costs are appearing in fuel budgets, grocery bills, and the financial margins of businesses and households that had no role in the decision to enter this conflict and have no mechanism to influence whether it escalates further. The former CENTCOM commander confirmed this week that the United States military has been actively developing plans for an Iran ground operation. The Marines in theater were not deployed to be recalled without being used. The president has not closed the door, and the only declared partner in this conflict has told its own media that its soldiers will not be walking through it. 10 helicopters flew in the dark because the story they were carrying could not survive the light. The question now is whether the American public whose soldiers are in position and whose money is paying for what comes next will be given an accurate account of what is already happening before the next decision is made for them.